How often do you think about the Oscars? About how many Oscar winning films there are and how many you've seen? Yeah, there's a few famous Oscar winning films that we've all seen, The Godfather and Lord of the Rings and Titanic, I'm King of the World, all that stuff. But the Oscars have been running since 1927. There are currently over 1,000 films, feature length films, which have won an Oscar. How many have you seen? I did the numbers for myself. It's not many, and I consider myself quite a movie buff. So here then is the premise of this podcast. Every episode, I and a rotating cast of two guests will randomly select one of the 1,000 films that have won an Oscar, watch it, and talk about it, with the only requirement being that one of the three people on each episode has to have never seen the movie before we talk about it. That will get difficult with Star Wars. Please note that our coverage of a movie does not constitute an endorsement of it. My least favorite movie of 2016, David Ayer's Suicide Squad, won an Oscar for Best Makeup, while my favorite movie of 2016, The Handmaiden, wasn't even nominated for anything. Please also note that our coverage of a movie is not a blanket endorsement of any or all of the people involved in it. A lot of terrible people have won Oscars. Kevin Spacey won an Oscar 20 years before he was outed as an abuser, and Roman Polanski won one 20 years after. But every film, good, bad, or in many cases mediocre, that has won an Oscar is an important part of film history just for being there. And they all, on some level, deserve a tiny bit of consideration, even if that consideration ends up concluding that it's garbage. And with all of that in mind, I'm your host, as always, Ellie McConaughey, and with me today is Edric,
Hey everyone.
and rejoining us is Conor Duffy.
Howdy.
And we are here today to talk about The Country Girl, a 1954 film that won Best Actress and Best Original, just Best Screenplay. They keep changing the names on me. At the 27th Academy Awards. Very good year at the Oscars, if I'm being real. Although I
Mm.
don't know if I'd count that. It was nominated for a bunch of other stuff: picture, director, black and white, cinematography, and art direction. But I don't know if I count this. I feel like the sense I got from the group chat is that people weren't really vibing with this movie, frankly.
No.
There is a word for movies like The Country Girl, and that word is adequate.
Yeah,
It was a movie. Is all I can really say.
sure was a film. Yeah, I don't. As I've said on a couple of occasions, I'll probably keep saying until I've felt like it's established as part of this podcast rhythm. I don't really do plot recaps. It's just not my style. But the basic plot setup is that Grace Kelly, who's our Oscar winning actress, who honestly, I can see it, I get it,
Mm.
is the long suffering wife of an alcoholic actor who's getting his last chance to get on Broadway again. Very in play that always looks very bad in every single clip of it we see.
It does. It does look really awful. It's difficult to make it's difficult to make a play or a movie within a movie like look as good as a real play or movie would be
Mhm.
because you have actors who have to act acting. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, you're right. It looks like the sort of thing that would have been absolutely destroyed by critics.
It does, and it's from '54, and the play it's based on is from '50. So they had musicals that people still like back then. Like they had Oklahoma and Carousel. Although I have thoughts on Carousel that I'm not sharing. I don't know. It's interesting. You make a good point that acting as acting is always extremely difficult, and I feel like the movies or plays or whatever that do the best at it are really trying to stylize the internal media. It's an example I can give. Ah, hell, I'm just gonna be cliched. I saw the TV Glow has its internal TV show, which
Mm.
is very clearly like a Buffy or I guess Erie, Indiana, maybe pastiche, and so it doesn't need to be feel super authentic. It just needs to feel convincingly like Buffy.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
I would say Natural Born Killers does a very good job of portraying that 90s crash TV style,
Hmm.
but that's a very stylized film
Yeah,
in its own right. So,
I every time I see Natural Born Killers, I like oscillate between this movie is brilliant and this movie is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. I can't decide.
why not both?
Why not both? Yeah, it's. I did manage to gather before we started, Edric, you were saying that you were like this movie tested your focus, as I recall.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was like 8, and I have been unmedicated for so long.
Same hat.
And normally I can manage to be maintain an okay focus if I don't have something else to do, but this movie just really tested me.
Hmm.
I was like, I don't want to watch this. It's too boring, and but I have to for this.
It's not a very interesting movie. Like the movie ended up comparing it a little bit to in our like in our like talk about the movie in the group chat was Uncut Gem. And I think I'm the only one who's seen that movie here.
So far, yeah. All what I know about Uncut Gems, and I know you mentioned it before, it's a movie that is essentially just an anxiety attack,
Yeah,
and I haven't yet reached the emotional point that I'm ready to deal with like a 2 hour anxiety attack.
Me neither.
my aunt was like, we should go see a movie for your birthday that year, and she took me to see Uncut Gems. Like I don't know, and she like walked out half an hour
Yeah.
before the end. No, no, like the thing that made me think of it is there's a scene in that movie which I really like. So Adam Sandler is the main character, and his wife is played by Idina Menzel. And there's this really great scene like halfway through the movie where he's like coming to her and giving her this long emotional apology, and every so often they cut to her face, which is just this look of like, I have heard this so many fucking times. I cannot deal with hearing this again. Just utterly, completely fed up with her husband's bullshit. And
Mm.
like that is the vibe I got from Grace Kelly the entire movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you, like there are points in the movie where I could see what gave Grace Kelly the nod, and you know with the understanding that one does not have to sympathize with a character to find their story interesting or for them to have a good story.
Mhm.
She really is, for much of the movie, if not the entire runtime, the only sympathetic character from start to finish. Like I felt pity for Bing Crosby's character rather than anything else. And if that's what he was aiming for, then he was very successful. But I found Kelly's performance to be what's the best way to put it? It's a very 1950s melodrama performance.
Mhm.
It's good in the confines of that. If we follow the Roger Ebert mentality that it's what a movie is about. We shouldn't we then if the movie is telling you this sort of if it's a 50s style stage play melodrama about people not talking and then talking very dramatically, then then she does very well in that role.
The 50s melodrama is like, it's one of the thoughts that I sort of had thinking about this movie is like the acting style is very 50s,
Mm,
but like the usually the movies that people cite as the changeover of like acting styles are Marlon Brando's like big famous movie Streetcar Named Desire, which was a couple years before this, and On the Waterfront, which is what beat this movie in most of its categories.
mm,
This was On the Waterfront year, so it's interesting. I feel like this like 54 is very much like in retrospect kind of a changeover year
mm.
in how movies were made. I'm trying to think of what else won. What else won that year? Barefoot Contessa, which I've never seen. Yeah, and the rest was just like On the Waterfront down the line.
Yeah, it surprised me to look at the nominees and the winners that year, and you know realize that, like, oh wow, this was like a turning point in Hollywood cinema, wasn't it? Because yeah, you have you have On the Waterfront, which was nominated for everything. You have The Barefoot Contessa. You have Judy Garland, who was nominated
Yep.
for Best Actress for A Star Is Born. Sabrina was nominated.
Rear Window.
Yeah,
Mhm.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was one Best Art Direction, Set Direction, Color, as opposed to Best Art Direction, Set Direction, Black and White.
Those separate categories stick around for a while. I feel like another movie we covered made that distinction too.
Mm. Yeah, like it's a remarkable like examination. Like Alfred Hitchcock was nominated
Mhm.
for Best Director for Rear Window. When I was looking at Grace Kelly's filmography to see what else she was doing around that time, she was in a ton
Mhm.
of movies in 1954, including Rear Window and Dial M for Murder. The former of which I have seen and really enjoyed, and
Mhm.
she was much better in. But
She
I wasn't a member of the Academy in 1955, so
No, no, she's like, I don't know, like what, about a year out from becoming like Princess of Monaco and retiring from acting, right?
yeah, like her last film, 1956. Those were her last couple of movies, and that was it.
Yeah, it's the story is really interesting to me because like you how do I make this make sense the way it sounds in my head? So like the overarch the arch of the story is arch whatever. Connor's here. I got it. We got to have a debate about how to pronounce something.
Oh, you mean the overarching story? It's a yeah, it's a yeah. The C is pronounced like an S, I believe, and the H is silent.
God love you, Connor. Um, no, the arc of the story is that Grace Kelly, her name is Georgie in the movie, I recall.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Georgie Elgin.
Her husband is this like kind of like incredibly pathetic user, and the main tension of the movie is watching him. Like this director wants to put him in the play, and the main tension of the movie comes from watching him lie to her about like tell her that he feels really stressed and then lie to the director's face about what happened and then lie back to her face about what the director said and like
Mm.
just like try to keep both these people either of them from ever having a confrontation with him.
Because all I wanted to say was that he's just a coward.
Mm.
Yes, that is the main thrust of the movie. He's like kind of just this pathetic, cowardly guy.
The frustrating thing about that is that he is a coward. It's a 144 no 100 yeah no yeah it's an hour and like 44 minutes long, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And for an hour and 39 minutes, he is this coward, broken by the death of his son, which he was, we find, spoiler alert, he was, he's ultimately responsible for. Lack of concentration, and his son runs off and gets hit by a car. So he's driven by like this guilt, and so he drinks too much, and he never like tells anyone the truth in case it would result in them not liking him,
Mm-hmm.
basically. And so for like an hour and 39 minutes he's like that, and then we see him kind of hit rock bottom, and then the last 5 minutes of the movie, William Dodd's character, the director, is like, "Come and take a look at him on stage," and he's fine, and he's great, and he's regained his confidence, and he's able to speak his mind to both of our other leads, and the song that triggers the tragic memories of his son's death, he can hear it, and he can deal with the pain, and find a way to get over it, and then the movie ends. So we see none of the sort of A to B movement of this character. And
Mm-hmm.
we see almost none of that. We don't see that for any of them, actually. It's very much it's and it I guess you have to say that it's kind of the time, like you get all of this drama, and then the drama is very quickly resolved. We won't see that, but that's okay. But it's all very resolved, and everybody has a satisfactory ending, even if it's not an entirely happy one.
Now, I will say I don't know if the ending was entirely satisfactory for Georgie in my estimation,
Mm,
Yes.
because she outright said I don't know how many times she wanted to leave him
mm.
as long as he got on his own 2 feet, and then she goes back to him at the end.
That's hugely frustrating. I think if you made this movie today, it would end and should end with Georgie deciding that she didn't want to be with either of these guys.
Yep.
And then, the final shot would be her walking out of the party and her, you know, you could have if you wanted, you could have a little visual moment where you see, like, you get, the director's view from the hotel, and he sees Georgie and he sees Frank and he sees the two of them, and there's a silent moment, and maybe they hug or something, and then they go their separate ways. You know,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
visual storytelling 101 right there. They're all grown, and then he turns back to that night, the morning news reviews, and fade to black. Yeah, like, I totally agree with you. Like, it was not a satisfactory ending for Georgie at all.
I do think you could have the the movie end with her staying with Frank, but it has to be played kind of like a tragedy.
Mm,
That, like, this is,
Yes.
she's devoted so much of herself to fixing this man that there's just nothing left of her
mm,
without him. And
Yeah.
you could make that work, but like I had this thought when I was watching it, and I mentioned that I wanted to bring up the Tammy Wynette song "Stand by Your Man,"
mm, yeah.
and like that is a very similar, like, the story of that song is a very similar story to this one, but that song is a tragedy. But what struck me as interesting is, the first place I heard that song, I first heard the Chicks cover of it from like 2001 or 2,
Oh.
which was the B-side to their song "Goodbye Earl," which, for those of you in the audience who don't know, is about a woman teaming up with her best friend to murder her abusive husband, and then they run away together. So, like, including "Stand by Your Man" in that is basically like a punchline. Like, haha,
Hmm.
no. So, like, I feel like audiences, would expect in the 50s the happy ending is that she stays with her husband,
Yeah.
but we're not in the 50s. We're 70 years later.
Just, I was trying to gather my thoughts.
Fire away.
No, go on.
No, I'm done. I'm done with my little rant there.
Just, I feel like if this was readapted for modern times and we hit the tragedy undertones, part of it I feel like there would almost have to be a slight horror undertone too, because like
Hmm.
she did basically get subsumed into this pathetic coward of a man, and then just to end on that note in the movie, it just felt kind of horrific to me too.
It did feel very horrific to me, and I don't like. So I said this in the chat, and I have it repeatedly in my notes. Like, we sort of like glanced off it, but like one of her, like, how do I put this, motivations for leaving Frank is that, the director of the play is in love with her, Dodd, who's a character I do not like at all.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Terrible, terrible. Like, there's just nothing there, and I feel bad for William Holden because
He's a good
he's
actor.
been in good stuff, and he is a good actor, but man, he is just he is struggling here with the paper thin characterization that he's been given.
So like he's in love with her, and they like kiss in a moment that is so much not about romance. Like, man, but like every time the romance comes back into the movie, I'm like, this is hitting real fucking weird,
Hmm.
man.
Yeah.
If I was gonna remake this for nowadays, just cut that whole
Yeah.
thread out.
There are two ways that scene ends in 1954 when the movie was released. Kelly gives this impassioned speech. She does her thing. She's very passionate about it. They don't touch, and then she goes to the door and she says her final line, and she walks out, and she slams the door, and then we get a shot of him turning away from the door, and we get an expression on his face that reads, for everyone in the back, everyone all the way up to the cheap seats, "Oh, I was wrong." So we either get that, or we get what we get here, which is, they're both so overcome by their passions that they have no choice but to kiss.
But like that scene up until that moment was really working for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
It's the scene where like Dodd, the director, and Georgie both finally like realize like, oh, he has been lying about me to the other person a lot.
Mm.
And like that's like that's and she basically has like a freak out. I really liked the recurring bit about how she just wants her own name because Dodd keeps calling her Mrs.
Mm.
Elgin,
Mm-hmm.
which again that's a like that's a good thread. Pull on that thread, but like when I drop it. Yeah, very bad movie for my boy William
Mm.
Holden.
It's
Mm-hmm.
terrible because there's no setup for that romance in like in the third
Mm-hmm.
act, and it's completely forgettable. Even after like this dramatic kiss, you forget all about it until you get to the end of the movie, and the two of them are alone again, and they have to think about what are we gonna do. And it's like, well, every scene that you two had basically involved the two of you arguing. There was definitely no romantic tension in what you were doing.
No.
Like there, like none, absolutely none. And it's crazy because you would think that like if they wanted to have this sort of like romantic undertone, this kind of like sexual tension that's building between those two characters, like Grace Kelly and William Holden could totally do that.
Mm-hmm.
In the hands of a director who knew what he wanted and was able to convey that to his actors, then that's maybe that we would have gotten that. And then and it would have felt more earned when they both had this argument, and the kiss would have felt way more consensual as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess
Mm-hmm.
that's too much to ask from the director of Airport.
Airport, man.
And I'll admit, I'm not a huge movie buff. I'm wanting to get into more movies and watch a lot of older movies.
I'm really sorry that this was the first one part of this
Yeah.
show.
And
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but go.
no, you're totally right. And I'm just in here like, if this won best screenplay, how are the others?
Well, I looked at the other screenplay nominees. One of them is Rear Window, which instantly like, sorry, that's it. You go with Rear Window. You could probably Seven Brides for Seven Brothers is also like very good. I haven't like Sabrina. That doesn't that also have William Holden in it?
Yeah, William Holden's also in Sabrina. It's funny. You know what else? You know what other movie Bing Crosby is in this year in 1954?
Fire away,
White Christmas.
man. All of them are just doing so much
All
this
of them
year.
were
Yeah.
in so many other movies. All of them were in so many better movies.
And it was this one.
But this is the one. This is the one that won Kelly an Oscar.
I do get
Mm.
it on like an overview of the Oscar, the way the Oscars think. Like we've been talking a little bit in the Discord about The Whale, which is one of my least favorite Oscar
Mm.
winners, and like I don't want to accuse the Oscars of anything, except that I do all the time. Literally 80% of this podcast is me like talking shit about the Oscars. But there's this like habit of you have this glamorous or handsome or very famous actor sort of like dressing down. You use makeup or certain styling to make them look less glamorous. The Whale's a really good example. Monster is an extremely good example, and then they get their
Mm.
Oscar.
Yeah.
And like this is one of the only instances where I think I can remember seeing Grace Kelly not looking
Mm.
glamorous. So obviously that's where she's going to get her Oscar.
Mm-hmm. Which I mentioned earlier. I was astounded by how dowdy they made her look.
They did, I don't want to take away from like she is doing a extremely good work with the material she is
Mm.
given. We already talked shit about my boy William. I actually don't really think Bing Crosby is very good either.
I will say
I,
that I admire that Bing took on a role that is very different to the ones he is most famous for. So I will give him
Mhm.
credit for trying, and I think that there are times like there are times when he does well. There are times in the movie that I will say impressed me.
Hmm.
You know, I but it's funny. He was nominated for best actor that year, and
Hmm.
Brando won the nod for On the Waterfront. And if you compare and contrast those two performances, they really encapsulate as we were saying earlier, the shift that was happening in
Hmm.
American cinema, in Hollywood filmmaking in the mid 1950s. Because Crosby's performance it's impressive in parts, but it still feels very theatrical, very much a performance
Hmm.
of the stage, you know. Whereas Brando in On the Waterfront, you still have a little bit of that, but you could see that, you know, that method style of acting was coming more into play, and he did more with his body than,
Yeah.
than you see from Crosby in this movie. And Crosby is performing like someone who got his start in, in vaudeville, in stage, who, quite rightly, because of his musical talent, became much more popular. His musicals and his comedies are what he is best remembered for. But yeah, I will give Crosby credit for trying, even if he ultimately failed. Just like I give Kelly a lot of credit for taking some material that, in another actress's hands could have been really, really bad, but she puts in the work, and it pays off, at least for her when she is on screen. It is, at least we have her.
Yeah, I was thinking about Crosby's performance, and it just like one of the thoughts that I had is like he's such a he has this like natural charm to him. You know, it's pretty standard. You know, we've all seen him performing various musicals, and like I think that the director picked him because you combine that natural charm with this character, and like I think you could make it very cloying. I don't think he gets all the way there. I think that there's a handful of scenes where he is authentically like really hard to look at. Like the scene in the dressing room after the police station is a really good, like I do not want to look at this man
Mm.
anymore. Oh no, Edric's making a face. What did I say?
Just, and he, so far from what little we saw, he was possibly a better man, but he reminded me a lot of my father.
Mm.
Hmm.
So just, yeah, I really did not like him.
I mean, like I'm never opposed to like engaging with a movie in a way that's personal to you. You know, a friend of mine once accused me like you only think To Keep My Mom's one of the best movies of the decade because you got to think about mom. I'm like, yeah, I do. So what? Leave me alone. No, but like I think that you're right about the very stagey nature of it. And it did start out as like a stage play, and I think you can usually tell when something starts out as a stage
Mm.
play in film, especially in films of this era, because people are it's just the way it's
Mm.
shot and the way it's paced. I would be interested in seeing like the original book. I really you mentioned this already. I really feel like you know there's the scene where Dodd basically gives him a stand up and stop being such a little drunken shit moment, and then they have a like shot of him cowering in bed as he hears Dodd fighting with the producer in the hallway. Smash cut to the first performance of the play, and he's fine. I'm like, there is a scene
Mm.
missing there.
Yeah, there's some, like, I don't know if there was if in the stage play we spend more time with Frank becoming a better man and earning
Mhm.
his plaudits at the end, and seeing him, like, become the man he used to be. But if there was, they needed to retain that, and maybe cut out some of the, like, really pointless filler. Like, we don't need to see Frank repeatedly not be good at his job. We don't need to see the same scenes, which are basically, as you meant as you were talking about, as we were talking about earlier, like Frank telling his wife one thing and the director another, and the two of them
Mhm.
then having an argument because they're both being given conflicting information. There's a better paced movie here that we unfortunately don't have, and it's a terrible shame because I would have loved to have seen a performance from Bing Crosby where, we watch him as this, this drunk, this deadbeat, this guy who has completely lost all confidence in himself, is terrified of conflict, and so says whatever he has to do to please everyone, even if it hurts him, even if it hurts the people that he is surrounded by. I would have been very much more impressed by his performance if we saw that, and then like we had a third act that allowed us to see him turn into, you know, Bing Crosby,
Mhm.
the Bing Crosby we like to watch, who is, suave and is confident and is strong in his performance. It probably would have made for a stronger film overall, I think, if that's what we would have gotten, because it also would have given us an opportunity to see why Georgie goes back to him, why she chooses to end the movie with him. I think there are a lot of, like, there are a lot of gaps in this movie. There are a lot of issues that the film has. The pacing is one of them. It was an awkward time. It's an awkward time in Hollywood because as we said before, the cinema is changing. There are some shots in this movie that are really like I watch them now, and I realize, oh wow, that's you just never see that anymore. Like when Georgie and Dodd meet each other for the first time,
Mhm.
and we stay on a wide shot, and William Holden sits down, and he has and he and like a chunk of the conversation is then had between the two of them with his back to the camera, and we don't see his face as he talks. And I realized as I was watching that, it kind of took me out of the movie for a second, because I realized, oh yeah, we don't they wouldn't shoot that these days. They would do like a two camera setup so we could get like cuts back and forth, so we could see the actors expressions as the other actors is talking.
There's a certain kind of like, and it's all over this movie, which is what made me think of it. A certain kind of shot that people back in the 40s and 50s was very popular back then. I think Spielberg is still a big fan of it. I am cribbing a lot of notes here from Every Frame a Painting. Don't point it out in the comments. Do we have comments on this? Whatever. Basically, it's a like a 30-second to 90-second long oneer to just like get the scene over with
Mm,
quickly. Spielberg is very very fond of them, so they're kind of like his now. Because you're right, people do over. I don't want to say over edit because that's not really the problem. Over plan a lot of dialogue scenes like they do, you know, over the shoulder, two cameras in the crowd, one in the middle, do 10 takes, make decisions in
mm.
post. And like that's fine sometimes, I guess, but I feel like it often leads conversations feeling very sterile. And I do miss like this movie does have a lot of things where they just hold a single camera position a lot and let the actors move around it and interact with each other. And I miss that shit, man.
Yeah, I mean, it works from time to time, I think, but I also think that I think that there's stuff in here that I would have liked to have seen more of as well. Like, there's a scene in the theater early on when
Mhm.
they're rehearsing the script, and Dodd calls it for the night, and then we just have this conversation between Dodd and Frank, and most of the lights are out in the theater, so you have like these small spots of very stark light, which always looks really good in black and white. and
It does.
and then Georgie shows up, and because of the conversation they were having beforehand paints Georgie in a very villainous light. So when she suddenly appears, like she's kind of backlit. We don't see too much of her face at first. Then when we do, like, there's like I said, there's a lot of like nice stylized shadow, and so you get this like visual depiction of how the two men see her in that moment, or how Dodd sees her in that moment, as this, this villainous woman running her husband's life, keeping him from his freedom. And I thought that was a really nice, like, that was a really nice, like, nicely lit, nicely shot, nicely cut scene that told the story in a way that, kind of builds a little bit of doubt then in the viewer, because, the question then comes up, is Georgie the antagonist of this? Like, actually is she like keeping Frank hurt? Is she facilitating the addiction that is keeping him from, achieving his potential again? And then later on, then, when we learn a little bit more about her and she gets to express, like, her side of things, we you know it builds a more complex story than I think the writer director George Seaton. I think it builds a more complex story than I think he actually thought he actually set out to make. There's a part of me that wonders how much of this was how much of it was intentional, and how much of it ended up kind of accidentally adding complexity to this otherwise run of the mill melodrama.
So I went and looked, and the play that it's based on is unknown enough that it doesn't have like a full plot summary on Wikipedia, so I can't tell what, if anything, is missing from it. I will say that an hour and 44 minutes is extremely short for a play, even with a 15-minute intermission. I feel like there has to be stuff missing. But the actress who originated the role was Uta Hagen. She didn't pick garbage roles. Like I think that I think that there is like, if we try to like cast ourselves back to the 50s a little bit, which oh boy, they're sending me to shock therapy, yay.
Yay.
No, no, jokes. If we go back to the 50s mindset a little bit, I think that the intent, again, I don't know if it really lands for me in 2024, is like, you are supposed to buy his version of events in which, after their son died, she fell to pieces, and then as soon as he fell to pieces taking care of her, she suddenly recovered, which turns out to be basically completely
Mm.
bullshit. I do think that you're supposed to buy that and then sort of like slowly realize, like, oh no, I was wrong. My expectations have been subverted. I will admit that the first time I heard that story where he's like talking about how she attempted suicide after the death of their son and like went to pieces, a lot of that made me. I mean, I wasn't about to side with him because one bit of reality subtext I don't know if the movie's totally aware of. It says he says that they've been married for 10 years. Grace Kelly was 25 when this movie came out.
Yeah, but in the glasses and the dowdy outfit, she looks at least 27.
At least 20. Like, and you're like fucking 40, Bing. No, sorry, you were like fucking 40 when you would have met her. What the fuck are you doing?
She's very mature for her age, Ellie.
FBI, open up.
Just
You'll find in the state of Minnesota where they got married.
Bing's become a libertarian. He believes very strongly in age of consent laws.
trying to strike a chord and it's probably a minor.
Okay, I'm getting back on topic. I'm getting back on topic from outside of the crimes of Frank Elgin. Christ. No, like I do have several notes on that scene that you're talking about, and like Georgie, after she's arrived, and she is like framed like a
Mm.
villain, but she also gives this like really lengthy speech about how creepy the theater looks when the lights are out. I'm like, is this going somewhere? And then it just never comes back. I don't know. Like, I feel like there has to be a lot of stuff from the play that just like got dropped. Let's see, what else do I have in my notes that I really wanted to talk about? I had some truly unhinged stuff that I wanted to bring up. I already brought up Streetcar Named Desire. Uta Hagen, I mentioned her. She's in
Mm.
Streetcar on Broadway. I think she played opposite Brando
Oh,
too.
nice.
Yeah, I feel like, honestly, part of me almost feels like how do I put this? I feel like Bing is trying to reach for a more naturalistic style of acting. He's not reaching
Mhm.
it. Whereas Grace is like doing the 50s acting style and actually doing it really well.
Yeah, yeah. I was just about to say, like, I agree. Like Kelly, like Grace Kelly's performance in this movie, it feels very much of its time, in that it you know it feels very big, very kind of melodramatic. It does. If you saw it today, you would call it overacting. The equivalent of it today would be very Oscar baity type acting. Where you know you have the where she's she's going for the Oscar moment. She's going for the tears streaming down her cheeks. And the worst part of it is I never learned to read moment. But for again, like going back, like critiquing the movie, both as we see it today, but critiquing the movie as it was, as it fits into the style of cinema that was popular when it was released. It is a really strong performance from her. It kind of it's an example of how good an actress she was, and how strong her screen presence was.
Mhm.
I can only imagine that's why, that's why she ended up getting, cast and starring in not one but two Hitchcock movies that year. Like, Hitchcock loved himself a photogenic blonde who could act. So it's nice to see her get the opportunity to show her chops. We can look at it today and think, oh man, it's kind of old fashioned now. Like, it's kind of passe to look at it now. But at the time, it it was it that's a powerful performance from her. Again, with material that I don't think gave her a lot to work with.
One of the raison d'etre of this podcast was like, we see an Oscar as like the movie award. Is why it will never stop being funny to me that Bong Joon Ho referred to it as a local film festival award. God, he rocks. But movies that win Oscars aren't necessarily like remembered by everyone. This year at the Oscars, the name was, it was on the waterfronts year. I think it won all of the big awards except for this screenplay award. It didn't win actress. It didn't win supporting actor because it had three nominees, and I think they split the vote. One supporting actors, it won actor, obviously. One picture, one director, one story and screenplay, which is I think what they called just original screenplay back
Mhm.
then, because like the adaptation would be best screenplay since the story is already there. Whatever. And then they also have a best story award. God damn it, Oscars! Stop changing your fucking every time I think I've got this goddamn award figured out. So like I do think that it's worth like examining it as part of its era, but also to like ask ourselves like I'd never heard of this movie before. Had either of you?
No, I'll be honest. I never even realized Grace Kelly won an Oscar.
Never heard of it, but I heard so much about Grace Kelly. I wasn't surprised to know she won an Oscar at any point.
I think I like blandly knew that she won an Oscar, but like I didn't know for what. And like it's not. This isn't quite like The Aviator we did last time, but like this is by the standards of 1954 a pretty stacked cast. It's got Grace Kelly, it's got Bing Crosby, it's got William Holden. This movie's completely forgotten. So I think it is worth also looking at it from a perspective of 2024 and asking ourselves like, why didn't this movie stand the test of time?
I would argue the reason, even though it is a double Oscar winning movie, I would argue that the reason no one remembers it is because all three actors were in much better, much better remembered and more well regarded movies that same year alone. I
Mhm.
think, like I said, as well as The Country Girl, Grace Kelly was in four other movies that year, two of which were Dial M for Murder and Rear Window, which are, you know, classics of their genre. As I was saying earlier, Bing Crosby, he did this movie, and then I guess apparently he was like, "Man, that was a downer. I better call Danny Kaye and we can do something." Because the same year he did White Christmas, which is a stone cold Christmas classic, and
Yes, absolutely.
William Holden was in Sabrina with Audrey Hepburn, which is again much much more well regarded movie than The Country Girl.
Hmm.
So maybe it's simply a case of, all three actors went off. Like, Sabrina, that's a Billy Wilder pick, like
Yep.
that's Holden with Hepburn and Bogart. That can't help but be better than The Country Girl.
Yeah, definitely.
White Christmas is a fantastic musical, incredible performances, wonderful set pieces. Just, has a series of like classic songs that are now like staples of the season, and it's in full color, and it's a much better movie than The Country Girl. I can only point to the movies that I have seen from Kelly from that year. Rear Window, again,
Stone Cold classic.
stone cold classic. Like you could put that movie up against any film from its period, from its era, like its period, and any other era that followed it, and it is still a fantastic piece of like dramatic, thrilling cinema. It's why they keep ripping it off to make other versions of Rear Window, even today. And then you've got The Country Girl, which is a perfectly serviceable melodrama, acted pretty well, shot pretty well. Pacing isn't great, but overall,
Seems like you'd use another pass.
yeah, it fits the time in which it was made. I think I said, like, I finished it a couple of nights ago before we recorded this show, and what I said, after watching it, I in the Discord was, well, that's 104 minutes I'm never getting back, which kind of encapsulates it. Like, it just is.
I mean, William Holden also had like a really good decade. Like he opened the decade with Sunset Boulevard, which is also a Stone Cold classic. He won an Oscar somewhere in there. I think he exits the decade with I think Bridge on the River Kwai, which is again complete classic. Yeah, he won the year before this for something called Stalag
Mm,
17. Never heard of this. I guess I'll get to it
yeah.
one day. That's the great thing about whenever I see an Oscar movie. Never heard of this. I'll get to it. It'll take at the current rate we're going, it'll take us 150 years to get through the Oscars, but we'll do it. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's just like mediocrity doesn't stick around. It can win awards, but like even we covered a couple episodes ago we covered Green Book, which is another movie where like you could take stuff out of it to make it mediocre, but the stuff that makes it notable is also the stuff that makes it like terrible. So like I guess bunting doesn't you never get a home run off a bunt. Is that an appropriate baseball metaphor? I don't watch baseball.
I have become a baseball fan, and yeah, that's a fitting metaphor. Yeah, if you might get it, you might actually, it's a really good metaphor actually, because you might be able to get a base run from a bunt,
Hmm.
but you'll never get a home run. Just as you might get an Oscar for a bog standard melodrama, but they're never gonna put it on the AFI 100 best movies.
Edric, I feel like Connor and I have kind of run roughshod over you today. You got any thoughts that we sort of accidentally silenced?
My I have had my mic turned off sometimes, but yeah, I've just had not had a lot of commentary. You both know more about a lot more about movies in general than I do, so I'm just happy to give my commentary where I actually have any.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, like I will admit that like coming up with, like I've been talking about doing a month of the year where I select movies because those movies I really want to talk about. I will admit coming up with like connections to make this conversation feel fleshed out. It felt very much like I was trying to wring blood from a stone.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was like, I'm gonna reference a song from '68 and another movie in order to try to like make connections that make this movie interesting to me.
I would like to say, like, I would like to ask Edric, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, like, you may not have, you may not have the same kind of like movie history knowledge, and let me share you. It all just comes from like random tidbits of information that coalesce into something called trivia. But yeah,
Ow!
it's true, and you know it. We're both in this picture, and we don't like it.
Don't say it.
But I would like to ask, like, as someone who is kind of coming, coming into this kind of relatively fresh, like, you mentioned that you struggled with this film as well. You know, what would be, what would your like answer to that question be? Like, what is why is it that this movie, despite winning two Oscars, what is it about this movie that, despite it winning two Oscars, despite having a really good cast in, like, in the center of it, despite being shot well, being acted well, despite having a pretty decent score, like, what would your take be on it? Like, why has it been forgotten despite being the only movie that Grace Kelly, a legend of Hollywood, despite it being the only movie she ever won an Oscar for? What would you say to that question of, like, why has it been essentially forgotten?
To be honest, I don't know. I was gonna make a crack earlier about how, well, of course it's missing things. It's an adaptation,
Mm,
and like some adaptations are really good. Holes, for example,
mm,
Mhm.
but I think that's part of it because especially if you weren't into theater back then, or because okay, look, according to the Wikipedia article, it
mm,
only had two other runs later on. The play did.
mm,
Mhm.
So, hold on.
mm.
Play of the same name.
I mean, that means it didn't stick around very well. Very much itself, yeah.
Yeah.
See, that's something that I was not aware of. Like, that the play itself. You think, you hear adapted from a stage play now, and you think, okay, well, it must have been like a big deal, or it must be a big deal. And I guess, yeah,
Yeah.
as you say yourself there, the play itself was never a very big deal. It had a couple of runs.
So directly from Wikipedia, the it ran for 30 weeks in its original run from November 10th, 1950 to June 2nd, 1951, and it won two
They
Tonys.
have to. They have
But then after that, the next uh, run for it was in 1972, and then later in 1920, or not 1920, in 2008.
I'm not a theater girly. I will admit that like one thing I have absorbed through being friends with a bunch of people who are theater people, and that's how I met Connor actually, and also through like living in New York and having exposures that like people the same way that the Oscars often get it wrong, the Tonys often get it wrong. Dear Evan Hansen, one of do not ask me for my hot takes about that play. If you like the play, you will not enjoy them. Your comment about it winning the Tony doesn't necessarily mean that it's gonna stick around, but your comment about adaptation is really interesting to me because like one of my favorite really good examples, one of my favorite books and movies of all time is Lord of the Rings. Like I have a tattoo in Elvish. I'm a Lord of the Rings nerd, and like if you are familiar with the books and the movies, you will watch those movies with the knowledge that they cut out a huge amount,
Yes.
massive chunks of those books are on the cutting room floor. But you have to like make conscious decisions about what you cut out, and more importantly, what you do to fill in those gaps. Like you can cut out Tom Bombadil, but if the way that you do that is 1 minute they're outside the old forest and the next minute they're wandering in debris, people are gonna go like, "Hey, what's the dealio?" So I think you're right about the adaptation. Like, yeah, obviously there's stuff missing. I would question if they picked the right stuff to go missing.
Yeah. Not to mention, like, with Lord of the Rings, the whole cast and crew had a lot of passion for the project. They really loved the books. And in fact,
Mm-hmm.
if I remember correctly, didn't Christopher Lee know Tolkien?
Chris really was old enough to know Tolkien. Yeah,
So yeah, that makes a huge difference versus this. There's so very clearly pieces that were missing that could have given greater context. And Grace Kelly especially did the best she could, and that she clearly earned an award for it, which is great, but like there's just not enough to really, despite it having 140, the runtime it does, which is still a very short movie.
It's not it's absurdly short by play standards, and not very long by movie standards. Like another movie podcast I really liked, We Hate Movies, has a standard that they use for movies, which is shorter than Star Wars, because the first Star Wars movie is at 2 hours and 1 minute. Like that's an extremely well paced movie, and this is shorter than Star Wars. And I don't feel like it uses its time very well. And I am gonna say, just so we can put this here, to insulate myself from people yelling at me, which is what all of my online activity is built around. It's 100%. None of us have read the book. It's 100% positive that the one country girl stan in the entire universe is gonna pop into my mentions tomorrow, the day after I post this, and tell me actually it was a 1-to-1 script, play stage to film adaptation. There's nothing missing. At which point, what do you expect me to do about that, man?
Edric, I think you bring up a good point actually when you mentioned earlier, to discuss, adapting Lord of the Rings, how there was a lot of passion among the cast and crew for the work that they were doing, and I think that might have made part of the difference as well, because the Lord of the Rings trilogy, that was 2-3 years of work, where they came together and formed a bond and a friendship, that's remained strong forever. Whereas for the Country Girl, that was one of 5 movies that Grace Kelly made that year. That was one of 4 that William Holden had released in 1954. For them, it was less of a passion project and more of a good script and character that was, that they were given the task of. And I wonder if that maybe makes part of the makes a part of the reason why it's so, forgettable too. For them it was a job. For, I don't know, for Marlon Brando back when he was still young and hungry, taking that lead in On the Waterfront was more than just a job. It was a passion. It was a chance for him to show what he could do. So I think you bring up a good point there about, it's about not just what was cut out, but how much energy was brought to the project by everyone who worked on it.
I'm imagining Grace Kelly doing all of her performances this year, or not this year, obviously, but before, like Krusty in the recording the clown, recording the doll lines bit where he just walks in, reads the lines off, and runs
Hey,
out.
hey, hey! It's Frankie. All I want is a room to my own.
Gosh dang it, Frankie, stop
Stop.
lying, stop drinking.
Let me go. Mwah.
See, learn from a professional, out the door. No, you're right. Like I don't. It's also very interesting because like we talked a lot about that one scene in in the theater where like it's very well shot, it's very moody, it's very well, like there is, it's not always there, but you can like see this audible clunk when the movie moves from like, okay, here is a scene with a lot of care put in direction and lighting and blocking, and then there's like, well, we got to get through this scene real fucking quick, so I don't know, man. Point the camera at Bing on stage, have him sing the song. The first song that he sings in the movie is basically like a 3 minute long shot of just Bing Crosby kind of like meandering around back and forth across the stage, occasionally intercut with reaction shots from the director and
Mm.
producer. And like that's the other thing, man. Like if you're gonna make it a musical, make it a fucking musical. It's walking up to the line. It's got what, like 4 or 5
Yeah.
songs, but none of them are diet. Oh, none of them are like in character musical numbers. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't a musical, was it?
The play in the
The original play.
musical was actually a musical, I think, but
Okay, that would actually, if there are songs missing,
Mm.
that would make a lot more sense. Frances McDormand and Morgan Freeman in '08.
yeah,
Wow.
There must be something to this. It keeps attracting, and there's Uta Hagen and Paul Kelly Man, it keeps attracting big fucking names. There must be something to it.
There's clearly a scene in the stage play that got cut out of this movie, probably due to the Hays Code. You know, there must be some like really wild out there scene that lets an actor go, oh yeah, now I can get really freaky and people will call me brave.
The play was produced for television twice, in '74 with Georgie Elgin played by Shirley Knight, and in '82 by Faye Dunaway.
What?
My mind is falling apart, y'all. I'm I'm gonna have to go read this play. There must be something
We have
missing.
no choice. We must purchase the rights to stage this play, and then we need to call Margot Robbie's agent.
I can only make that call once. I'm not blowing it on this. I mean, I do think I'm normally like I want to do a remake of this Oscar-winning movie is usually a sentence that makes me break out in hives. Spielberg's West Side Story notwithstanding, I do think like a remake that like you cut out the romance angle, you make it more of a
Mm,
tragedy, and like you flesh out. You could make this really work, or you could just write something new, which is always going to be my first inclination.
mm. Yeah, it's just a shame. When I finished watching the film, a story came to mind, and you both might be familiar with it. I'll recount it in full to the best of my knowledge for the listener sitting at home or sitting in traffic. But it's a story from the early days of Saturday Night Live. Bill Murray and Chevy Chase get into this like shouting argument. They are, they're yelling at each other, they're calling each other names, they're shoving each other. I don't think it came to blows. Like the rest of the cast and crew members came in and separated them and held them apart and were able to kind of like end the fight before they started like throwing hands. But as they get pulled apart, Bill Murray shouts at Chase, medium talent. And yeah, like just the most that like that's the most devastating thing you could say to to an artist. You know, like not that they suck, just that they are decidedly average at best. And for me, on the whole, the country girl was the cinematic equivalent of medium talent.
You know that Grace Kelly is clawing her way out of the grave to beat the shit out of you now, right?
I could take her. She's got to get across the Atlantic, right? I don't.
I think that's true. She'd be pretty tired. Yeah, I think that that's a reasonably good note to end on. Edric, I'm sorry that your '50s film education had to start here. If we ever get around to I don't know, Sunset Boulevard, I'll rope you in. You wanna do you have anything you want to plug?
I have nothing to plug, so.
You're smarter than me. Connor, do you have anything you want to plug?
You can find me on the trash fire that used to be Twitter. I am at young Mr. Duffy. You can find me sporadically on Blue Sky under the same username. And my wife and I have got an itch.io page. We are Third Country Press. We make one-page RPGs and little fanzines and supplements for the world's most famous tabletop role-playing game. Check it out. Throw me $1. I am, not too proud to beg.
I have played some of his one-page RPGs. They are quite fun.
As always, I can be found on Football and Tuxedos at tumblr.com, with dashes between all the words, and on Twitter and Blue Sky at LSR42. My Medium page is also LSR42. I post there once every 6,000 years. And you can also find at iwanttoreview.blogspot.com my blog where I reviewed every single episode of The X-Files and The Lone Gunman. It took me 7 years.
And that's, I feel, kind of it for the Country Girl. Next time, I will be reteaming with the duo who saw me through Green Book on hopefully a much more interesting movie than this one, a much better movie than Green Book, 1967's In the Heat of the Night.
Ooh,
Thanks both of you for coming out.
thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. Yeah, this was an experience.
Unexperienced. That's the movie.